All right. Well, goodness knows we're living through some strange times at the moment. In the UK, we're now in week 3 of the lockdown, and I'm talking to you from central London. It's a beautiful, bright, clear, early spring day. And I've lived in London for the majority of my life, but right now it doesn't look like the London I know. It looks pretty much like a ghost town. Everything we take for granted seems to be shifting beneath our feet. COVID-19 is taking us to a new and most unwelcome territory. I think it's fair to say that nobody alive today has lived through an emergency which literally involves the whole world, which is why I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by Dr. Liz Royale to talk about the psychological stress of living with COVID-19. What we're going to talk about is how you can maintain your mental well-being during the lockdown. I mean, in extraordinary circumstances, our Prime Minister is now in intensive care just a mile away from where I'm speaking from at St. Thomas's Hospital, which shows what an awful kind of democratic disease this is. It can take anyone, and it's pretty frightening for people and makes people extremely fearful, which is why I'm delighted to welcome Liz today. Liz, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Jim. Thank you. And thank you for having me today. Looking forward to a good conversation.
That's fine. Really, I'm really looking forward to this, as indeed I'm sure is our whole audience. But before we get underway, Liz, I'm going to put a slide up here. Whoops, I was going to put a slide up here. I am putting a slide up here, which I hope you can all see, by the way. Put a slide up here about Liz. This is who I'm talking with, Dr. Liz Royale. Liz, people can read the slide up there, but just tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay, in a nutshell, so I have 23 years experience of working in crisis mental health and with psychological trauma. Tended to work across the whole range, so preparing organisations, response, a lot of hands-on work, a lot of work at the coalface, and quite a lot of clinical work with people with PTSD. So very much a specialist in that field, but we've got a passion for innovating as well. We've always looked at mental health services and looked at how can we improve them, how can we make them more accessible. And, strangely enough, all the work that we put in place for that is now, meaning that we can reach people who are working remotely or, having to change the methods of the support. So it's very interesting times.
They are strange, interesting, and a little scary too. Now, I've prepared a few questions for Liz, but if the point I want to make here is that anybody listening, our audience out there, if you want to put a question to Liz, then please do so right away. Hopefully on the Zoom software, you can see a Q&A box there. I'm looking at one here. And if you want to pop a question in there, please do so and do it right away. As I say, we're not going to wait until the end for questions, and I'll put your question to Liz, and I'm sure she'll do her best to answer your questions. Well, I guess I better sort of get underway on this. So my first question for Liz is, you've written that emotional distress is a natural reaction to what is a very abnormal event, and goodness knows it is abnormal. How can you unpack that for us a bit? And what do you mean by that? And how does it manifest itself?
Okay, this is a phrase that is commonly used in the world of psychological trauma. It basically means that when something happens that's unexpected, distressing or shocking, and when we feel we've got little or no control in changing it, then of course we're going to react. That would be quite a natural thing to do. I think you'd agree that the current crisis ticks all of those boxes and some. So the first thing to remember is that the emotional reaction can manifest in different ways. In the middle of the crisis, we're all having a very unique experience, and we've all got different backgrounds, resources, coping styles. I'll keep coming back to that, it's very important. But having said that, fear and anger are the emotional equivalents of the fight or flight reaction, the human response to threat. So we'll see varying degrees of those. Maybe a little anxiety or irritation, but right up to panic and rage. And as time goes on, the emotional reaction can include things like low mood, depression, tearfulness. Every crisis brings a loss of some sort. So these are natural reactions to that very abnormal event. And depending on how we personally interpret what's happening, we might also feel emotions such as guilt, helplessness, or just be numb. They're all very natural reactions.
Yeah, okay. I suppose, and we're going to talk about, being stuck in the home and lockdown and working from home and so forth. But I suppose initially, some people may struggle with it straight away, but initially I think we've, certainly in our family, found a bit of fun. Everyone's around. The dog has certainly loved having everybody around. But I guess as time goes on, that doesn't apply and it becomes much more stressful. Would that be true to say?
I think everybody goes through the process in a different way,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
it's very important to recognise the differences. Yeah.
Okay, no, fine, absolutely. So you can see I've got another slide up here. We're obviously living through a health emergency. Would you characterize it as a mental health emergency, or is that too extreme?
Well, mental health and physical health are very closely linked. So I suppose it would depend on how we define an emergency. I think there are two issues. Firstly, the need for supporting mental health is higher than ever because people will be having these strong reactions and they will be having them at different times in different ways. So we need to look at ways of reaching a lot more people with crisis-informed psychological education so that they can help themselves and understand what's happening. The second issue is that mental health services are traditionally delivered face-to-face.
Yeah.
Mental health is not an area that lends itself very easily to change. It's a very slow-moving profession. And that's a particular challenge for people who have got crisis and trauma because it's a specialist field as well. So crisis mental health.
Can I ask you, Liz, are you
Yeah.
doing, you obviously have clients, and so are you talking to people like over Zoom or over Skype or something? Does that work?
It works to a point. So what we're having to do, I work with some very high-risk people, people with PTSD. Sorry, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. Very good on acronyms in mental health.
Yeah.
PTSD. And we're having to change the way that we work. So we're having to step back from doing active trauma work into a lot more stabilising, containment, that kind of work. So we're sort of slowing things right down because it's just not safe to do some of the work at that level by Zoom. Well, a lot of crisis mental health work although it's very different to general stress and resilience, a lot of it starts with normalising symptoms and offering appropriate strategies to reduce them. So I think as we navigate through this crisis, we can learn a lot from the field of psychological trauma and recovery, the principles of that.
Okay, good. Well, let's get to the kind of meat of this, if we will. Can you walk us through what it is about the current situation that makes people so fearful and vulnerable? And, obviously it's the threat of catching COVID-19 is one of them, but I think I'm right in saying it's more than that as well, isn't it?
Yeah, there are a lot of complex factors, but a lot of it is the lack of control and a lack of predictability. And
sorry to jump right in on you here, but I totally get that. One thing that I got right away is if we knew that this was going to go away in a set time, we could kind of deal with that. If we say, all right, this is going to be hell for 2 months, 6 months or whatever, but then it's over. But nobody knows. And I think that's very unsettling for people.
That is very unsettling because we all like to have control and predictability. And alongside that, there's the fear that our basic needs won't be met. So if you think about it in psychological terms, we all have an unspoken implicit belief system, and that's what keeps us psychologically safe. So it's things like, I've got some control of my life, I can predict the consequences of my actions, good things to happen to good people, all of those subconscious assumptions that we have to have in order to cope with life have suddenly been shattered. And going back to trauma work, we talk about shattered assumptions. That's what makes something so difficult. So realising that we don't have control, we don't have influence over what happens to us, all the things that we used to rely on, the routines we took for granted. Even things like, the ability to get your hair cut or your nails done, they're quite trivial in the great scheme of things. but they're the little familiar routines that make up lives, and suddenly we have no influence.
Liz, there's a question come in which is very pertinent and is exactly what you're talking about now. So I apologize for interrupting, but it just seems like the moment to do it. And the sort of question and comment is, very much this week I have zero energy. It says that it's their fourth week at home, and I'm suspicious that I don't feel like working. But I don't actually think that's it. But what else can it be? I'm not anxious in any way, but just the person asking the question just has zero energy. And I guess that's a symptom, is it? Or
it is. And I think later we'll be talking in a little bit more detail about the fight or flight response. And when we can't fight and we can't run away, we sometimes get into a sort of a more of a passive state, that it's just sort of, what's the point? What's the point of doing anything? Because it's not going to influence anything. I can't control, I can't influence. It's almost that feeling helpless, but maybe not connecting with the emotional side of it, but it comes out in your body. And another possible cause can be the stress hormones. We live with such a high degree of stress generally, we quite often don't even notice it. We just accept it as background noise. But the fluctuating stress hormones can be exhausting. And learning all the new things that we're having to learn, you know, it's just emotional information.
So people are feeling, because of the stress, people are feeling kind of physically exhausted.
That is very, very common with acute levels of stress. You know, that real weariness.
And can we suggest anything to help? Or can you suggest anything? I wouldn't like to suggest it.
I think maybe we'll cover that later when we actually talk in a bit more detail about the physical response of it. Because yes, you can. There are lots of simple things that we can do to help ourselves.
All right, great.
But what I would say is, the first thing, and I'll keep repeating this right throughout, the first thing we have to do is accept that that's actually where we are, and that is a natural reaction. You know, we've had our control taken away, we've had our familiar structures taken away, we've got insecurity, unpredictability, unease. Of course, we're going to have some reaction to it. We'll vary dramatically in the reactions that we have, but that's because we're all unique. And so it's about, you know, not feeling that there's something wrong with you, but saying, actually, this is a signal that I actually need to do something to help myself.
Okay. We got another question coming in. And you're probably going to say we'll talk about this later, but I can't help but engage our audience. Have you any tips to prevent loss of sleep due to worries about the current situation?
Yes.
Are you going to?
Yes. And I'm sort of thinking, do we just throw all these questions away that we've pre-prepared, because it's just, you know, we are going to cover these. Let's engage the audience, but maybe let's encourage them to listen a little bit longer.
All right, fine. I'm going to tell you when these questions come in, and we can take a view.
Okay.
I think we can talk. We can move on towards this fairly.
If I can just add one little bit
go ahead.
About the you know, what is making this such an unusual. It's not just about the shattered assumptions. It's the losses and the potential loss of basic needs, financial, social, the need to belong, freedom, and being surrounded by stories of other people's losses, people that we know or we can empathise with. There's such a lot to take in over a short period of time, and some people will react with denial, you know, it's just a flu, rather than face reality, or it can all just feel a bit surreal, and both of those things are ways of coping with the current situation. So there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's about accepting that that's a natural human response that's trying to protect us.
Okay, all right. Well, let's dig a bit further into this. You've already mentioned fight or flight. Neither of these things are really available to us with the coronavirus. The coronavirus doesn't care. And all of these can create chronic stress symptoms, which we've been talking about. Can you talk about some of the common symptoms and how do we recognize them? And then when we've done that, perhaps we can talk a little bit about how we can overcome them.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be good. So what we have to think about is the chronic stress symptoms are the continued activation of this fight or flight response. So if I just give you a brief overview of the physical changes in the fight or flight response, because understanding it is it's quite empowering. So if the human body, the human mind is faced with threats, it will make changes in your body. And some of you will know this. It won't be new to you. But one of the things is that our body will change the way that we breathe. So it will breathe shallow, it will breathe quickly in order to take in oxygen to power our muscles up. Now that's a really helpful thing when you're faced with a tiger. But when it's chronic, what we might notice is that our breathing stays shallow and rapid. We might feel lightheaded or dizzy. And that's a sign that we're not breathing well. So if we understand that, then we can look at, okay, how can I change my breathing? It gives us a rationale for doing some of the breathing exercises, learning how to calm our breathing, because that will calm our nervous system as well. So another symptom can be that if we're fighting a tiger, we want our heart rate to be high, we want our muscles to be tensed up, we want to be ready to act. But over a chronic time, we might notice a tight chest because our chest muscles or our back muscles will be tense. We might get headaches because of that. We can find that we've got racing heart or palpitations, and we can have all kinds of things like tingling fingers. So these are all signs that are very, very familiar to anybody who's in a crisis situation. Long term, they'll notice these. And we, in a emergency situation with the tiger, then we're going to have changes to our digestive system. So our liver is going to release fatty acids and sugar to give us a quick energy boost, and our digestive system is going to shut down. Now, in a chronic situation, we might find that our appetite is really, not as it usually is. We might have irritable bowel, or be back and forth to the toilet, or we might just crave fatty and sugary foods. And I don't know if anybody has noticed that they're snacking more, that they're not snacking necessarily on apples.
Liz, I've just eaten a chocolate biscuit.
Yeah.
I really have, actually.
So we crave them. So that is your body trying to replenish the stocks that your liver is releasing into your bloodstream. So it's not just a case of willpower, it's a case of actually, this is my body saying, it's a signal of distress. Even, sort of things like we might get skin rashes, eczema might flare up. These are all caused because the blood's being diverted away from our skin to help protect us in an emergency situation, but in a chronic situation, the changes in our skin, we get clammy, we get sweats, that can cause these kind of rashes and skin problems. So some of the really small things that we don't attribute to chronic stress are actually a symptom of this continued activation of the fight or flight, but it's at a chronic level. Now, the good news is, yes, we can do something. Going back to the person who's saying about sleep. If you're faced with a threatening situation, the last thing that your brain wants to do is sleep, because it doesn't make sense, does it? Your brain wants to keep you awake. So you're in your survival system here, and your brain's saying, don't rest, don't sleep, don't relax, focus on the threat. That is your survival thinking. And your survival thinking actually shuts down some of your higher level thinking, your problem solving, your focus, your concentration. So it's recognizing that we've got to retrain ourselves. Now, there are two really important things as part of this. One is to avoid triggering the fight and flight response by excessively watching the news, excessively talking about it and thinking about it. And I think we're going to talk about that later. But the other thing is that when you're in your fight or flight system, you're actually, you're activating a different part of your nervous system. So if you think, I'll put it very simply, if you think of your nervous system as split in two, and you've got your sympathetic nervous system, and that's responsible for fight or flight, responding to threats. And you've got your parasympathetic nervous system that's responsible for calming and soothing the body and the mind. So you need to be in your parasympathetic nervous system if you're going to sleep or relax or be able to think really clearly. But at the moment, we're way too far in the sympathetic. Now, what we can do is we can take active steps to rebalance. So anything that will activate the parasympathetic nervous system is going to feel really alien to us, because our brain is saying, no, 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 think about the problem, think about the threat. That's hardwired to do that. So we've got to deliberately say, I'm going to do some calm, steady breathing, because as I deepen my breathing and as I slow my breathing down, I'm activating my parasympathetic nervous system. I'm tipping the balance in my favor. So we work with the system, with the body, rather than fighting it. So breathing exercises can calm it. We can burn off stress hormones with exercise. So that will not only burn off the exercise, it sort of kids your body into thinking that you've done some fighting or running. And in fact, those two exercises are things that we do recommend to people who've got PTSD. You know, if you've got a punch bag, that's fantastic, or a cushion. You know, do use your fight. Your brain is very, very clever, but it is also very easily tricked into thinking it's had that fight. Or run, anything cardiovascular. You might not be able to run outside, but you might be able to run up and down the stairs, or do some, some high intensity exercise. It will vary from person to person. That might be just not available to somebody. We've got to think a bit more creatively about how can you do some exercise, but that will calm your nervous system. And it also has a definite knock-on effect with sleep. Now, there are no quick fixes with this, because you've probably been for at least 2 weeks having this stress hormone, the fight or flight, flooding through your system. So what you're having to do is a little bit like turning a tanker. You have to keep making these small steps of exercise, routine, breathing exercises, and putting them in through the day. And slowly but slowly, if you're persistent with these, and if you're structured and you keep going, they will start to have a knock-on effect. Now, there are 2 other things that I definitely recommend. First of all, if your body and brain are in a state of high response, you don't want to push it up any further. So avoiding stimulants, avoiding caffeine. Don't know how many people are drinking more coffee than they normally would, and alcohol. And it seems to be that people are drinking more alcohol when they're actually at home all the time, and it is becoming almost more socially acceptable. Been reading it in the paper about certain celebrities, you know, who were just waiting for wine o'clock and saying it in a jokey way, as though, you know, that's perfectly okay. So we can buy into that, but what it will do is it will push our levels of arousal, our levels of physical response even higher at a time when we're trying to bring them down. Does that sound sensible? Sorry, I ranted a little bit there.
No, it's okay. I just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, which I've been thinking about as well. And we're about to talk about working from home. But I think one of the things that people miss from working from home is the fact that they have no routine, and that's a word that you've just used.
Yeah.
And I mean, is there any way? Is it worthwhile trying to establish some kind of routine? I mean, people talk about actually getting dressed and, not staying in your pajamas all the time and actually going to work, as if you would. Is there anything beneficial in that?
Yes, definitely. And again, if you think about it from the psychology of it, from the crisis side of it, crises take away our control. That's been said a few times, but it's very, very true. And if we bring in some structure to our day, that's our way of actually trying to recreate that level of structure, routine, and control. So it can make us feel as though we have some level of influence over what happens in our day. I've seen a few times people have said, when you've got no control, when there are big things you can't control, look for the things you can control. And it's a good sentiment, but it's actually a better way of thinking if we say, look for what choices you can make. Because some people will still feel as though they have no control, but we always have choices. So I can choose to get up at the same time as I normally would. I can choose to allow myself half an hour lying in bed because I'm not commuting, but I'm doing it, for me, or I can still get up at the same time. Having a routine, start your day as you would normally, the normal time, finish your day at the normal time, take a lunch break. That might not have been part of your work routine, but do it now.
Yeah.
Put those breaks in. So definitely routine is very, very important. And if we can mirror what it would normally be, then that's even better.
And it's so interesting. It's such a new dynamic. And some people, I in my past life and other jobs, I've worked from home quite a bit, and I'm quite used to it and quite happy. In fact, when I started doing it about 15 years ago, it was considered frantic, weird, and basically didn't do anything. You just hung around at home. And I think, but which I didn't do, I hasten to add. But, I think for some people, my wife, for example, can't bear working at home. She likes the cut and thrust of the office and has always had that. And I think a lot of people struggle with it. It sounds like a nice idea to work from home, but it can be a struggle for some people.
Definitely. I mean, I've worked from home for the past 10 years, and it took me a long, long time to adjust. And part of that was having that routine. But even for those of us who are used to it, what might now be the problem is that we're sharing our workplace with other displaced people, and that can bring a whole new set of problems. I mean, I was used to everybody else would leave the house and go to work, and the place would be my own. And suddenly I'm having to now share that.
Negotiate, yes.
Yeah, and that negotiation is really important. And I think having your own space is very important. And that's great if you live in a really nice big house that you can all have your own workspace. But even if you're all cramped together, making sure that you have that own little bit of space of your own is really important.
Yeah, and it is really hard for people if they don't have a garden or something like that.
Yeah, and I think again that's where we have to look at the variety of responses that some people will be having a very different experience to others. So we've got to recognize that.
One thing we're doing at our company, which I just share, which I think is worked really well, we have twice weekly meetings where everybody jumps on Zoom, puts their cameras on, and we just have a chat. And it's not necessarily, in fact, it isn't about business. We're not looking at business. We're just connecting, just telling any little stories that may have come. They're sort of basically replicating the kind of stories you might tell each other when you first arrive at work, or when you go to make a coffee, or at the water cooler, or something like that. It's just, that sort of, that kind of way that we all communicate with each other during the work day. And it's not quite the same, admittedly, but I like it, I must say. Have you come across that?
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And humour. I mean, you'll probably laugh at this, and it is a bit silly, but we have, because there's 3 of us now working from home, and I find that the tolerance and humour really help. we have a pretend tea trolley service. And
Right.
it's
Okay.
really a really silly little ritual whereby I tend to be the tea lady for some reason, I don't know why. I will go around the various places that people are working, and we have this little game where I'll say, you know, tea trolley, morning tea trolley, and I'll go through the selection of cold drinks and warm drinks, and everybody always orders the same as they did yesterday, but they have to listen to what's on offer.
Right.
And it's a silly ritual. I mean, you know, it makes no sense at all, but it's just a chance for us to check in, have a bit of banter and a bit of escapism.
Yeah.
And we've got used to it now, this morning tea trolley and afternoon tea trolley. And, you know, sometimes it is those silly things. It's recreating what you would normally have.
Well, I think that's a great practical piece of the tea trolley. Let's hear it for the tea
It would
trolley.
be nice if somebody else did, you
Yeah,
know, somebody else took a turn on it, but yeah, it's just a bit of fun. And sometimes you just need a bit of surrealism.
exactly. Just a little craziness to stop you going crazy. Is there anything else you want to say about working from home? Is there anything else, or are we good with that?
Well, I noticed on your slide there, you've got advice for companies. So do you want me to include that one?
Yeah, why not? Actually, that would be really helpful, Liz, if you would, please, because I know a lot of people who are working from home are listening to this. So yeah, anything from the company's aspect would be great.
And again, I do keep banging on about this, but recognise that your staff will be having different experiences and they're going to be working from diverse settings. So, you know, they will have a variety of needs. They might have very different levels of safety and privacy and workspace. So start with the basic needs. And I imagine most organisations will have spent a lot of time sorting out equipment, workspace, you know, talking about not sitting on the settee so you don't have a bad back, that kind of thing. But actually ask people what they need now. You've got through that very practical bit. Ideally on a one-to-one setting, checking in with them, have they got what they need? And consider the individual. So, you know, you've given an example of how you do it, which is normal for your company. But if you're trying to bring in new things that people wouldn't do at work. I've seen things, you know, about people sharing a little bit more about themselves and, you know, the pets and stuff. And that's fantastic if that's your workplace culture. But if you've got somebody in your company who really values their privacy, that might be a bit intrusive for them. There might be peer pressure to behave in a particular way. There seems to be a lot of, you know, sort of bravado and, oh yes, you know, we're all with spirit and we're all in it together. And that can leave people feeling like they've been left behind if they're not at that stage yet. So always keeping in mind, you know, you don't want to fragment your groups. You want
It's such a good point, Liz. I hadn't thought of that, and that is such a good. Not everybody wants to do this stuff, and
no,
the more
but
tiring people
that's
may find it really
yeah.
something they might even dread doing. Which I must say that hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah, and it can lead to people concealing their emotions, which is actually what, you know, we don't want to do. But I mean, video call where possible, because 70% of the communication is non-verbal, but it's actually interesting because it's a different kind of stress when we video conference. There's no hiding place. It's harder to read people as if you were in a proper meeting. You might have tech difficulties or distractions. And there's always the thing that, you know, when you first start doing it, it takes a while before you settle out of that. Stop just looking at yourself and critiquing how you're looking, you know, and concentrate on what you're doing. So it can actually be, it's a new thing for people. It can be stressful from that point of view. So just expect a loss of productivity at the beginning. You know, the brain space is going to be taken up with other concerns. So just accepting and normalizing that. It can be good, start the day with a check-in and end it with a review, because a lack of communication and collaboration is the top issue for remote workers. So that having them feel like they belong, but doing it in a way that mirrors your usual practices if you can. I think the social breaks, as you mentioned, if that's what they do normally, then they're fantastic, because you know, people can have a virtual lunch break or a virtual tea break. But this also leads to the question of skilling up your managers. So you need to be able to skill up your managers and your team leaders quickly and easily so they can recognise these kind of issues and be able to support the staff. And I think we've just all got to be quite innovative at this time. And one of the problems is that the creative brain, the problem-solving brain, is slightly hampered when we're under stress. So, you know, preparation has been crucial for this. So, does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, we've talked about that. You can see the next question up there, or comment. More to do with families. Now, we've talked about this, and this is a very tricky issue to deal with. But of course, some families, if there's a loving family, it may even have a row at the end. But if you are in a very stressful situation, maybe suffered a recent bereavement or one of the other ones mentioned there, can you talk about that briefly, please?
Yeah, it is. And again, I think some of the media messages are very sort of, you know, happy and smiley, and this is what you can do. They're very action focused.
Yeah.
And the danger is if we focus too much on, you know, actions and solutions before we've actually looked at where people are, they just don't buy into it because they're stuck in what they're feeling. Similar to the workspace, the first thing to do is find yourself a private space and agree that that's your retreat place. And that might be a room that you can shut the door on, or it might be a corner of a room where you can put headphones on, but everybody needs an emotional bolt hole. We've got to respect everybody's need for that. So, you know, if you know that that person, if they've gone into that room and shut the door, they just need a moment or, you know, 10 minutes, respecting that. Being more tolerant. When we can't control the big things, we can't get obsessed with the small things, and suddenly it can be really important how somebody stacked the dishwasher, but actually it's not really that important. But if you recognise that it's just the need for control, so we're going to put that onto things, and I was getting irritable about little things and spotted that, you know, pretty quickly, and just having to step back and say, actually, is this really important? Does it really matter? And if it doesn't, just, you know, almost saying to myself, okay, this is just me trying to get some control. But if it does matter, then use that as a reason to sit down and, you know, have a conversation about some basic rules. Sharing tasks, creating a routine, they will all help. But I think one thing to point out about the sort of the wider family and the wider social network, again, the disparities. One thing that I've noticed is there's huge differences. You know, someone who's working, who's physically exhausted, who's really, you know, got high workloads, it can be so frustrating when you're hearing about other family members or friends sitting in the garden, catching up on the DIY, spring cleaning. So you've got a fracture there in your social network.
Yes, people in the same house are doing very different things.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I get it.
Or there may be financial worries, you know, for one household that they're really concerned, and another one, you know, thinking actually, yeah, we're fine, and you know, we're getting full pay, and we're just chatting about what we're spending, you know, the time doing. So recognizing all of the different coping styles, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's about saying they're doing it differently, they're coping in the way that they can, and tolerating that. But for people who are already having, you know, issues at home, and you know that all of the issues we've talked about are amplified. So if we're already stressed, anxious, or depressed, we might find that this becomes overwhelming. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that some people will be more vulnerable. The raised tensions at home lead to increases in alcohol abuse and domestic violence. And I think employers need to remember that their staff are not immune to this. And so it's always important that we put safety first and give people the opportunity to access support and feel secure. And, you know, maybe just checking having those individual check-ins with people, giving them the opportunity to raise any issues and looking at how we can support them. So hopefully managers or team leaders would have some idea of what's happening for people at home. Not always, but I think it's really important just to look at the context when you're checking in on people's well-being.
Yeah, indeed, Liz, indeed. Just going to move you to another question. We've dealt with this a little bit before, but it's kind of extension of what you've been talking about. Just sort of practical ways of helping settle your thoughts or your emotions. And you've already mentioned sort of limiting your watching the news too much. What else can people do on a more practical level of reducing their stress?
So, I mean, you mentioned the word mindful, and I don't know that some people may not be aware of what mindfulness is.
Yeah, give us. I'm not sure I am. I'm used to it. I'm sure I know what it means. Tell us about it.
It all sounds a little bit pink and fluffy, I think, sometimes, mindfulness and meditation. But they're both really good techniques for calming our thinking. And what they'll do is they'll just temporarily switch off the worry about the future. And mindfulness and meditation are very, very simple strategies to learn. And really what all they're doing is they're helping our thoughts to slow down and then re-engaging our calm thinking. So you don't have to sit on a yoga mat and burn incense sticks. You can be mindful anywhere. It's about noticing. Mindfulness is very much about noticing your surroundings, looking at it in really, quite vivid details, what you're experiencing right now. Noticing, if you're sitting on a chair, where your body is supported by the chair, the sort of the temperature of the air. If you have a drink, what does that taste like? Really focusing all your senses on what you can hear, what you can see, and you'll notice that your mind wanders off into other things, and it's just about keep bringing it back.
It's sort of like meditation, is it?
Very much like meditation. Meditation is simply about focusing on something that is sort of fairly neutral. It might be a sound, it might be breathing, it might be, a flickering flame, just something fairly neutral, and focusing on it. And every time your mind wanders off, you just bring it back and you focus again. And it's about building or extending that little space between your thoughts. Everybody can learn it. The reason that most people say, oh, I can't do that, is because they think that they're meant to sit there with a blank mind, and that's not the case at all. It's just about building those spaces. And every time you slow your thoughts down, you're re-engaging your parasympathetic nervous system, you're calming it. And this is a great one for sleep. And there's loads of resources on the internet, guided visualizations, guided practices. So don't be put off by thinking they're all a bit pink and fluffy, because there's real science behind them. Because the other thing is, at the moment, we're on a constant news feed. Everything is virus related. Even the adverts on the television, everything is related. So your brain is just constantly being triggered about the threat. So we've got to keep that balance, and we've got to sort of, take it away and say, actually, I need to now focus on something else. There is a real world and a normal world, but it's just being completely squeezed out. And we've got to try and squeeze some of it back in. So limiting your news coverage, limiting your social media, maybe set a time. So say, actually, I do need to keep up with the news, but I'll only watch the evening report or the morning report, or I'll check in at one point on, whichever social media. So just keeping that, lowered. And also trying to set yourself a challenge of looking for some of the positive news stories. Sometimes that can be hard to do, but looking for the stories of recovery, stories of compassion, all of those things will actually help to retrain our mind into a more balanced perspective. So it's not about pretending nothing's happening and, being, in denial. It's about the balance.
I just had a comment from one of our listeners. It's not really a question, it's really an observation. They're very obviously not happy. They've tried a routine, very unhappy that they're not going to be able to go to church over Easter, and really want to go back to work, but that's tricky. I mean, how can managers handle, I mean, this must be not uncommon, I feel, and how can they handle a situation like this?
Yeah, it is. It's very common. Everybody's life has been disrupted, and all the normal ways that we have of nurturing ourselves, and it's things like our spiritual beliefs, and looking after ourselves physically, we're having to look at different ways of doing this. And there is anger about that. There's anger, and that's because we've had something taken away from us. So again, it's a natural response. Who wouldn't be angry about all of the things that you've built into your life being taken away? And what we have to do is we have to sort of be kind to ourselves and say it's okay to be angry and to feel angry. I'm a human being. And once we've accepted that and sort of normalized that, it's easier for us to then say, okay, what choices can I make now? So, I can choose to stay angry. And sometimes I might want to stay angry. Sometimes that's actually okay. But if I don't want to, I can choose to maybe see if there's another way that I can get what I need, or another way to do things differently. But it's a process. It is a long, slow process of adjustment. And it is very, very similar to, crisis and trauma reactions. And there's no quick fix with this. It's just keep moving forwards in the process.
Okay, well, thank you. Can I just say to our audience, if you want to place any more questions, please do so. You can post them anonymously. You have that ability if you don't wish to give your name. So as we are sort of coming towards the end of the webinar, just please, if you do want to ask questions, now is the time to jump in. Liz, I'm going to move you on here a little bit. You've talked about an emotional crisis having a 3-phase pattern. What is that pattern? What does that mean? And how can that help us understand what we're going through?
Okay, so again, going back to trauma work, one of the key things that we have to offer clients is hope. Now, as a trauma therapist, I understand the roadmap to recovery for them. And, as somebody comes through my door, I can see what stage they're in, and I can see where they will be going, what will happen next, and I can see ultimately that they will recover. And I have to be able to sort of give them that sense of, it is a phase that we work through. So I think it helps to know that actually this isn't going to last forever. And although we don't know what's going to happen with the wider world, we can have some understanding of what's happening for us and how, as human beings, our responses will change. So the first bit to do is to know whereabouts we are in the phases. So an emotional crisis tends to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the first phase is the fear phase. It's the time when we want things to carry on as they were. Right. So we might use denial and disbelief. We struggle to keep things going as we've always done them. Even though we can't do them, we focus very much on the I can't do this. We want things to stay the same, and we resist any changes to our coping strategy. Now, the fear phase is also the phase where people are very angry and very frightened, and they're constantly looking at the news. They're hoarding because they're frightened of having the basic skills taken away. As we move out of that,
actually, can I just jump in? That's I hadn't, with all the stripping of the shelves in supermarkets, I hadn't thought of that being as a psychological response to a problem. But I guess it is, isn't it?
It's fear-based. Yeah. It's based on I might not have
Yeah.
And it was interesting that as soon as it was on the news that, you know, there was a potentially that this was happening,
Yeah.
it spurred more people on to do it.
Right.
So there's the contagion. Oh, it is a fear. It must be a fear. It must be a valid fear. So, you know, that then kicks off other people's fear. And so yes, and then there's the anger about that, you know, from people thinking, if only everybody would, you know, not do that, you know, feeling really angry about it. So this is very much the early stages of it. As we move forward, we start to accept that we have to adapt, and we start to look for new coping strategies. We generally can't go into that phase until we've acknowledged the emotional impact of the crisis. And this is where the difficulties are, that, you know, a lot of the articles and the instructions about, you know, do this, you know, just take that action, do that. Until you've acknowledged your personal emotional reaction, you are less likely to take those steps. So we then move into the sort of the learning zone. So we start minimizing things like the news coverage. We start stepping back from it. We start letting go of the things that we can't control, and being much more aware of ourselves, our emotions, and, you know, looking at, okay, what can I do differently? And it's still a difficult time. It's still a big period of adjustment. But we start to become a little bit more creative and a bit more motivated. So, you know, if you haven't got the motivation at the moment, if you're feeling exhausted and you're thinking, you know, I don't want to do these things, then that's simply a sign that actually you're in that first phase, and that's fine. Everybody moves through it at different times. There's, you know, it's not a sense of, oh, I'm so much better because I'm in the third phase now. You know, that's rubbish. Everybody's different, and we move through them in different times. And in the third phase, that's when we're starting to find a purpose. We're starting to look at, you know, how can we be more caring of ourselves? How can we be caring of each other? And this is where we're getting into the feeling that things will not be the same at the end of this. The world will be a different place.
Is that a good way to think? I'm a little conflicted about that. Should we be thinking, gosh, well, things really aren't going to be the same again?
Well, I think they aren't going to be the same again, because all of our assumptions have been shattered, you know. So we will have to rebuild our belief systems, and it will be different. But that is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the same with a trauma. You know, in a trauma, people will never be the same again, but that doesn't mean that they're damaged. It means that, you know, they can be stronger, they can be wiser, they can be more resilient, they can have changes in their values. And, you know, that is the thing that we need to hold on to. But you can't fake it. So you can't sort of say, oh yes, everything's going to be fine, and, you know, the world's going to be a better place, if you don't believe that. And you won't believe it until you're in that third phase, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely.
So we can't pull people through it. It's more a case of recognizing where you are and doing the things at the point of that phase that will help us through.
Okay, I got a question for you, and it's this: is it normal for people experiencing mental health conditions such as anxiety or depression to be feeling heightened symptoms at this time?
Well, it's quite an unusual situation, actually, because yes, it would be very usual for that to happen. But what we're noticing is actually some people aren't. Some people are actually finding it easier because they're feeling less isolated and less stigmatized, because they're so used to, and I'm thinking of people, you know, who are at high levels of anxiety and depression. They're so used to being out of step with the world and feeling like there's something wrong with them, that suddenly, you know, they're used to dealing with this level of uncertainty in other areas of their life. So again, it's about, we can't make blanket assumptions because we're all individuals. So yes, some people will find it even more difficult. Some people will find it actually a little bit of a relief. That's the complexity of human beings. That's what makes my job absolutely fascinating. And, you know, being part of that recovery with them is always a massive privilege. So, yeah.
Right, that's an interesting response. Well, we're getting towards the end now. And I guess I sort of have to ask you, you know, obviously you've been giving us great advice and so forth, but if you do have some severe psychological symptoms as a result of what we're all going through, where can people go? How can people get help?
Yeah, and you know, I've been sort of skipping over the surface quite a bit because there's a limit as to what
Yeah,
I can
sure.
say. But you know, what I would say is don't ever be concerned about seeking support. There are lots of different things, you know, different levels of support that people need. Quite often, with crisis and trauma reactions, the earlier people seek support, the faster they tend to recover. So speak to your employer, look at what support they offer. They'll quite often be employee assistance programs, or speak to a health professional. You know, speak to your doctor. There is some good voluntary bodies as well for mental health. But get information. Information is incredibly empowering. And what we tend to find is that the psychoeducation that is available for people, you know, through various forms. That's one of the programs that we do. I'm not trying to plug it, but what we do is we look at really getting to grips with all the different reactions and normalizing them. That takes the fear out of them, because people quite often feel that they're going mad. And then looking at what can you do for those particular symptoms. So look for advice, look for support, and you know, accept that we are all going to react to this in different ways, and you don't leave it too late. The sooner you ask for some support, the sooner you can start turning things around, getting back on track, and getting some control back over how you're feeling.
All right, Liz. Well, thank you very much. This is going to be the most extraordinary case study for you. I can see another Dr. Liz Royale book coming out of this. I don't know if the book has already started yet, but
I haven't had a minute to start. It's a very, very busy time for us.
but it is going to be massively interesting. I know to reduce it
Yeah.
to a case study is ridiculous when it's everybody's lives, but it is the most extraordinary event for people like you.
It is, yeah.
Liz, is there anything? I think we're going to draw this fascinating discussion to a close. Is there anything you want to add, or have we covered what we need to cover in this hour?
I think so. I mean, we have done a sort of a longer information sheet that has.
If people want that, how can we get that to them?
Well,
how can we help with that? I could send.
Yeah, if you want to send that out, that's, you know, it just gives a little bit more sort of meat on the bones of what we've been talking about.
If people listening would like an information sheet for Liz, perhaps you could let me know. I don't know, but I will get hold of it and make sure that those who want it definitely get it, because I've actually seen this and it's really good. Liz, our hour is up. I'm going to draw it to a close there, and thank you very much indeed for being with us today in this really testing time for us all, I think, and giving us some of your insights, which have been fantastic. So thank you for that. We'll be running another webinar next month, I think, with the former policeman Chris Phillips, I think, is our next guest, talking about security in the workplace. But in the meantime, Liz, thanks so much for talking with us today, and goodbye to everybody.
Goodbye. Bye.
Bye-bye now.